Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our study of the Law of Moses. Last week, we began looking at the property laws, and we started with the linchpin of the whole system, the inheritance laws. Remember, inheritance is super important in the ancient world in general, and especially so in the Law of Moses. And there are a ton of spiritual applications to take out of that. We just started to scratch the surface last week in looking at the way that the Hebrew writer it talks about the promises of God in terms of the eternal inheritance. Right? So we're supposed to see the inheritance laws and a lot of the laws concerning the land as foreshadowing and being an antitype of the promises that we have through Christ, the promise of an eternal home in heaven with God. So we saw that inheritance, especially inheritance of the land, is to be perpetual. That's how it acts as a foreshadowing of our eternal inheritance in Christ. The land usually, under the law of Moses, passes from father to sons, with every son receiving an equal portion, except for the oldest, who receives a double portion. To keep the inheritance perpetual, the law also allows daughters to inherit if there are no sons, and it sets up a chain of succession, essentially, for if there are no daughters, no other close relatives. We looked at that long list that came out of that case law in Numbers concerning the daughters of Zelophehad. The last thing that we looked at, again, is a spiritual lesson that we draw from the inheritance. We receive an eternal inheritance through Christ, a place in the promised land of God's kingdom which cannot be taken from us. So having seen all of that, let's turn our attention to how the law governs the use of land in Israel, because we'll continue, I think, to reap some benefits in looking at the spiritual lessons that we learn from those laws, as we also come to understand how ancient Israel was governed in its use of the land. Now, some of these principles in the law work basically like you would expect them to, right? We talked last week about how on its face some of the laws seem to fit basically a modern mold, right? The property laws boil down to essentially don't take other people's stuff, and you are responsible for what happens with your own stuff. Mainly what your stuff does to other people and to other people's stuff, what we call liability law. Let's go ahead and start there. All right, now we also said last week that it would be a mistake to try to pigeonhole ancient law, and especially the law of Moses, as just being those two principles, and fitting into a modern, almost sort of libertarian view of property rights. We'll see that, because it's really only, well, we looked at the commandments against theft last week. Don't steal. Don't take other people's stuff. We'll see a little bit more of that next week. In this week's study, we'll look a little bit more at liability law, but it's really only those couple of sets of laws, which make up a very small portion of what the law of Moses has to say about property. It's only those that even begin to fit into that kind of modern mold of how we view property rights. As we're going to see today, a lot of what the law has to say about property is fairly antithetical to a modern and especially a libertarian view of property rights. So let's start with negligence laws, laws concerning your liability if your stuff does damage to other people or to other people's stuff. And we're going to focus specifically on the land this week. There are some parallel laws concerning livestock and other things that we'll look at next week. But let's look first at the land. We're going to turn to Exodus chapter 22, and we're going to read verses 5 and 6. If a man causes a field or vineyard to be grazed over, or lets his beast loose and it feeds in another man's field, he shall make restitution from the best of his own field and in his own vineyard. If fire breaks out and catches in thorns, so that the stacked grain or the standing grain or the field is consumed, he who started the fire shall make full restitution. All right, so this principle works almost exactly like you would expect, right? If your negligence causes damage to your neighbor's land, you're responsible for that, and you have to make full restitution for the damage. Now, it's not like theft, where, as we will see later on, you not only restore the thing that you stole, but you also pay in addition to it. Here, just full restitution is sufficient. But it's from whatever cause, right? If your livestock damages your neighbor's land, if some hazard from your land spreads onto your neighbor's land, so here it specifies a fire, right? You're liable for that. Right? You may not have been intending for your animal to get out and graze in your neighbor's field, and you may not have been intending for the fire that was on your land, or whatever other hazard on your land, to spread over to your neighbor's land. But if it happens, you have to make full restitution. All right? And we've talked about this before, there's a sense in which you may not be guilty. In other words, you may not, guilty in the modern sense, right, of having committed some intentional crime. The way that we use guilt colloquially in modern terms. It's a very, very narrow definition of guilt that you don't see like anywhere else. You may not be guilty in that sense, but you're still responsible. And that means you have to clean up the mess. You have to take care of what happened. Now, we actually get a really interesting case study for this law. That is an example of this law in play. We're going to look at what Absalom does to Joab's field. Now, what we're about to read comes right on the heels of the story about Amnon and Tamar. Right? You might remember the story. Absolutely terrible story. Amnon, well, remember David, like we've talked about recently, David has lots of wives, right, at least half a dozen, and he has sons through all of them, so he has all of these half-siblings. And Amnon, one of David's sons, rapes his half-sister Tamar. And David refuses to deal with Amnon himself. Right? As we've not really gotten into violent crime yet, but I think we've read enough of the law that we have seen places where the law has prescribed death for the rapist. And as king, it's ultimately David's job to make sure that justice is done. And since it's happening in his own household, he has absolutely no excuse for letting it go. But he lets it go. Right? And this is, by the way, right on the heels of David's sin with Bathsheba. Right? We always think of the sin with Bathsheba as like the big thing. And it's just one of a series of things where David shows himself to be a fairly rotten person. David completely refuses to deal with Amnon himself, and so Absalom, another one of David's sons, and again, Tamar, again, is David's own daughter, and he refuses to deal with this. But Absalom, another one of David's sons, he is Tamar's full brother. He takes matters into his own hands and has Amnon put to death. He does what David would not do. Absalom then has to flee to Geshur, but Joab, the general, intervenes on his behalf. And this all happens in 2 Samuel chapter 13. It's quite a bit of text from summarizing a lot. But Joab intervenes, and David gives Absalom permission to return to Jerusalem and live in Jerusalem so long as, well, David forbids Absalom from ever entering his presence. So that's where we pick up in 2 Samuel chapter 14, verse 28. So Absalom lived 2 full years in Jerusalem without coming into the king's presence. Then Absalom sent for Joab to send him to the king, but Joab would not come to him. And he sent a second time, but Joab would not come. Then he said to his servants, "See, Joab's field is next to mine, and he has barley there. Go and set it on fire." So Absalom's servants set the field on fire. Then Joab arose and went to Absalom at his house, and said to him, "Why have your servants set my field on fire?" Absalom answered Joab, "Behold, I sent word to you, come here that I may send you to the king, to ask Why have I come from Geshur? It would be better for me to be there still. Now therefore let me go into the presence of the king, and if there is guilt in me, let him put me to death." Then Joab went to the king and told him, and he summoned Absalom. So he came to the king and bowed himself on his face to the ground before the king, and the king kissed Absalom. So Absalom, and this fits into the broader story of Absalom. Absalom shows himself to be an extremely shrewd tactician by taking advantage of the law to get Joab's attention. And remember, Joab's no dummy, right? He's one of David's star generals. But Absalom puts Joab in a position where he can't continue ducking him. Right? Because Joab knows what Absalom wants, and he's not willing to give him this opportunity to have an audience with the king. But as we have, if you go back and you read through 2 Samuel 13, you'll see that David has ultimately become convicted that that he's wrong in what he's done to Absalom. Right? The wise woman of Tekoa shows him that through this object lesson that he teaches him, and we'll return to that much later in our it'll be later on in our study of the law, once we study the Goel. But David is convicted that he's done wrong by Absalom, and Absalom is trying to get into David's presence, and he is going to go through Joab because Joab is a relative and he's a favored general. And Joab, again, knows what all is going on, and so he refuses to answer Absalom's calls. He's ghosting Absalom. And so Absalom takes advantage of the law. He manipulates the law, right? And as we're looking at this example, we're not trying to hold Absalom up for praise as, well, look at how great Absalom is for doing what he did. Right? This is just showing his shrewdness in the way that he handles things. Because Joab's field is planted in barley, and because Absalom has had it set on fire, he's liable for it. And so if Joab intends to get anything back on this field, he has to go confront Absalom about it. And that gives Absalom the opportunity to make his request. And that ultimately bears fruit, because David calls Absalom in for an audience, and shows him some favor. Now, obviously we know that situation devolves very quickly after that. And it's just part of the broader story about how David completely botches things in his kingship. Right? It results in Absalom's rebellion, and it all falls on David's failures as a leader. Right? But I think a neat example of how those in ancient Israel would manipulate the law to their advantage. Right? One of many examples. Now, so as we've said, liability basically works like you would expect it to work. We'll see more examples of that next week whenever we look at the laws concerning other types of property, particularly livestock. But for now, let's turn our attention to ways in which the law of Moses does not work according to a modern understanding of property rights. And in doing this, we're going to turn our attention to the fundamental principle of the land laws. That you cannot do whatever you want with your own property, especially with your own land, because your private property does not ultimately belong to you. Right? Now, in modern times, we accept restrictions on what you can do with your property only in kind of a utilitarian sense. Right? You have essentially sovereign power over your own property to do with however you please, whatever you want, so long as you don't infringe someone else's rights. But that's the only restriction that we put on people generally in the modern day, and that's been the driving force behind all kinds of legal change, especially over the last quarter century to half century, a little more, the idea that there should be no restrictions on any activity and any use of property that does not infringe on someone else's rights. Right? This is true of all kinds of modern law. Right? That's the basic principle behind the Obergefell decision. Right? The idea that same-sex unions don't hurt anybody. Right? They don't infringe on anybody's rights, and that's the basic argument behind all same-sex rights. Is that the activity doesn't infringe on anybody else's rights, doesn't hurt anybody, therefore it ought to be permissible, ought to be enshrined in law. You see it behind that. We also see it behind basically open carry laws, right? The idea that you should be allowed to carry literally any weapon in view in public, so long as you are not infringing anyone else's rights. You're not brandishing your weapon at anybody. You've got it. You're carrying it safely. Underpinning that is this idea that so long as you're not hurting anybody, so long as you're not infringing anyone else's rights, you should have the right to do essentially whatever you want, and especially with your own property. And the law of Moses, and because ultimately modern law looks at your property and says it is your property. It ultimately belongs to you, and therefore you have sovereign rights over it. The law of Moses repudiates that idea. It says you are not the ultimate owner of your private property. It does not ultimately belong to you, and therefore the law places restrictions on property owners that are not based on any kind of rights-based argument. Right? The sorts of laws, the sorts of restrictions that we see in the law of Moses have nothing to do with you as a property owner infringing on someone else's rights. So let's go ahead and get into those laws. Let's start with, we'll briefly look at a couple of things that we have either already seen in the law or we're going to cover in more detail later on under a different topic in the law. For example, one that we've seen before, no mixed planting. All right, we covered this under the cleanliness laws a few weeks ago. The relevant text here is Deuteronomy chapter 22, verse 9. You shall not sow in your vineyard with two kinds of seed, lest the whole yield be forfeited, the crop that you have sown and the yield of the vineyard. Now, we looked at some really important spiritual applications of this a few weeks ago. I'm not going to go over all of those again here, so I encourage you to go back and review that material. The important thing to note here is that God places limits on what you can do with your own stuff, and it is based on holiness, on righteousness. It is not based, right? You cannot look at Deuteronomy chapter 22, verse 9, and say that there is any kind of compelling interest based on the rights of other people for the law to place this kind of restriction on you as a property owner, right? If I've got a field, or if I've got a vineyard, and I want to plant alternating rows of, grapes and pineapples, whatever. I'm being silly, fill in the blanks. Who cares? And let's even imagine for a minute that, well, hey, that wouldn't work, right? That your yield would be non-existent, or it would mess something up. Or, again, who cares from a modern perspective? But from the law of Moses' perspective, the law is interested in enforcing not rights, but holiness. And so the law places this restriction. Even though it's your property, you cannot do with it as you please. Another principle that we will look at in more detail later on is that sale of the land is restricted under the law of Moses, and it is not permanent in the vast majority of cases. We'll look at this in more detail in a few weeks whenever we cover debt, because this is ultimately a debt solution. But if you want to read ahead, you can look at Leviticus chapter 25. And all of the laws that we read there are rooted in this principle that we talked about last week of the clans of Israel each having an eternal inheritance. The land that they receive by lot during the conquest is theirs forever. It's not to be taken away from them. It's not to be transferred to another clan or another tribe. It is to stay within the tribe and within the clan in the tribe, which got it originally. That principle of eternal inheritance is the root of everything in Leviticus 25. Now, there are some applications here for how the church ought to help needy saints, which we will come to when we cover the debt laws. For now, I just want us to observe that land ownership under the law of Moses, again, does not function primarily at the individual level. Right? Just because you own the land now doesn't give you sovereign authority over it. If you read through Leviticus 25, you will come across a place where God himself claims sole ownership of all of the land. Right? Even though individual people in Israel own the land as their private property, ultimately the land belongs to God, and he is the one who wields sovereign authority over it. And even outside of that, it's not just like this duality of you own the land and God owns the land. It also belongs to your father's house, right? The land that you own was your father's land, and it was his father's before him. It's going to be your son's land later on, right? You're just a link in a chain, and the link doesn't get to claim sovereignty over everything, right? The land ultimately is held by the chain, and it is... the sovereign authority belongs to God, who put your father's house in that particular piece of land. Again, we'll come to that in more detail in a few weeks whenever we look at debt. But let's get into some detail, some things that just deal with land. Let's look at the poor laws. Leviticus chapter 19, we're going to read verses 9 through 13. When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap your field right up to its edge, neither shall you gather the gleanings after your harvest, and you shall not strip your vineyard bare, neither shall you gather the fallen grapes of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and for the sojourner. I am the Lord your God. You shall not steal. You shall not deal falsely. You shall not lie to one another. You shall not swear by my name falsely and so profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. You shall not oppress your neighbor or rob him. The wages of a hired worker shall not remain with you all night until the morning. All right, now I read a bit of extra text there because I want us to notice the context, what the law of Moses is arguing about your use of the land. And again, from a modern perspective, we would say, my land, right? I use my land the way I want to. And if I want to squeeze every last penny out of that land, it is my right to do so. The law of Moses says, it is not. Not only does the law of Moses give this command, don't reap right up to the edge of the field, right? You have to leave the edges of the field planted. Right? You can't even harvest it. Right? You plant it, but you do not harvest it. You leave that for the poor and for the sojourner. Even though it is on your land, and even though it is the fruit of your labor, it is not yours to take. And the law furthermore says that whenever you finish harvesting your field, don't go back through and gather the gleanings, right? Anything that you might have missed the first go around. Right? You've got one shot to harvest that field. You take out what you take out, and anything that gets left behind is left behind for the poor and for the sojourner. Same thing goes if you are gathering from a vineyard, right? And if you've ever gathered fruit off of a vine, you know how difficult it can be to be really thorough, especially since, the fruit usually comes in at different times. So you'll have, one cluster where the fruit has come in ripe, and you'll have another cluster where it's still a little green and needs some more time. And that, that makes sure whenever you go through, you are not stripping all of those vines completely bare of fruit. There will be something left behind. Whether it's on the vine or on the ground, you are not allowed to take it. And the law doesn't just stop at that. It doesn't just forbid you from doing that. In context, it explains what you are doing if you break that law, what it amounts to. In context, it's a law about theft. Right, look at everything else that we have read in context. Right? You don't gather the gleanings. You don't strip the vines bare. You don't steal. You don't rob your neighbor. You don't hold back the wages of a hired worker overnight. Right? And all of those things fit the same basic category. It is theft. Now, that's a radical idea. That you can be guilty of theft by reaping in all of the produce of your own property, by keeping all of the fruit of your own labor, of your own expense. That part of that, if you take it in, is considered theft. And that's a radical departure from modern norms. But that's what the law of Moses teaches about the use of land. Again, ultimately, the land is not yours. And as we'll see whenever we study Leviticus 25, one of the basic principles of living in the land is that everybody is a stranger, a sojourner in the land. They are sojourning with God. And so we're to act, Israel is to act with sympathy for sojourners. Right? Israel was poor and afflicted in Egypt, and so they are to act with sympathy for the poor. And it all centers on their use of their property, their land. Right? And that's a set of principles. Well, let's consider these principles. All right? When we look at those debt laws in Leviticus 25, when we look at the poor laws in Leviticus 19, those sets of laws give us a spiritual lesson about how we, as Christians today, ought to look at our own possessions. Right? Because there are some eternal principles here. Right? Some of the specific applications may change, but the principle is still there. We see it play out in the early church. Turn to Acts chapter 4. We'll read verses 32 through 35. Now, the full number of those who believed were of one heart and soul, and no one said that any of the things that belonged to him was his own, but they had everything in common. And with great power the apostles were giving their testimony to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus, and great grace was upon them all. There was not a needy person among them, for as many as were owners of lands or houses sold them and brought the proceeds of what was sold and laid it at the apostles' feet, and it was distributed to each as any had need. Now, take a minute and wrap your mind around this phrase. No one said that any of the things that belonged to him was his own. Right? The things that belong to me are not my own. That sentiment is almost paradoxical by modern standards. The things that belong to me are not my own. But it's an essential attitude that we find modeled by the early church in Jerusalem. Right? So we can have ownership, like we can consider things to be our property, so that if someone were to steal them from us, if they were to take those things from us without our permission, that would be theft, right? They would be violating our property rights. But at the same time, those very same things we don't consider to be our own. Right? That they are ultimately not for our use. They're ultimately for the use of those in need. Right? That is a radical way of looking at property. It's something that the early church picked up. It's rooted in the law of Moses. And it's something that, again, if the early church was doing it in this way, in the language of our own circles, we would call this an approved example. Right? This is the early church getting it right. And so the task for us is maintaining this attitude in the modern church, in the modern day. Do we view what belongs to us as our own? Are we going to be like Ananias and Sapphira in the way that we treat our property? All right, let's move our attention now to another issue in the law concerning the land, moving boundary markers. You are probably familiar with the content of Deuteronomy chapter 19, verse 14. Let's go ahead and read it. You shall not move your neighbor's landmark, which the men of old have set, in the inheritance that you will hold in the land that the Lord your God is giving you to possess. Right. The meaning of this law, landmark it's being used in a completely correct way in our ESVs here. But in our colloquial English, we think of landmark as something that guides you, like something that gives you directions, right? If somebody's, telling you how to get to their house, they might give you a set of landmarks, right? Turn right at such and such a place. The basic meaning of a landmark, believe it or not, is something that marks the land, right? And in its use in the law, the landmark is the sort of marking that it does is it's a boundary line, right? It's a property line. It's kind of like you open up the flat book, and you've got these topo maps that have the boundary lines, the property lines marked on them. In the ancient world, you don't have that. So what would be set up would be a series of stones or other monuments that would show the boundary lines between one person's land and another person's land. But the tempting thing about those kinds of landmarks is that they can be picked up and moved. We have something similar, by the way, in modern law. It's called adverse possession, right? Where if someone else owns some land adjacent to yours, and they basically let the land go, they don't tend for the land, take care of it, you can just kind of step in and clean up the land yourself and maintain it and take care of it. And if you document it thoroughly, and you do it, it differs by state. In some places you would have to do this for a long time, like 25 years. In other places you can do it, in a few short months. But if you document it through that whole time that the actual landowner has not done anything with the land, but you have been taking care of the land and have kept it cleaned up and productive, then you can actually claim possession of that land by law. Right now, it's going to absolutely infuriate your neighbor once he finds out that you have stolen his property out from under his nose. That's why it's called adverse possession. But you think in the ancient world, all you have to do, if there's a series of large stones marking the boundaries between your property and your neighbor's property, you just roll that stone over a couple of feet. Now you've got a little more land, right? And if it's a long boundary, and you move all those stones just a couple of feet, you've gotten yourself a lot of land. And the law of Moses explicitly forbids doing that. Now, on one level, obviously, we know the Ten Commandments. You shall not steal. Right? But this law is bigger than just property theft. Think back to what we studied on last week. What you are doing by moving your neighbor's landmark is you are taking part of the eternal inheritance. You are not just taking his land, you're taking his father's land, you're taking his son's land, you're taking his clan's land. If you are on the boundaries of the tribes, you are taking another tribe's land. You are taking someone else's place in Israel. Right? It's an almost unspeakable crime that you are committing against your neighbor. It's very similar to what Onan does to Er, right? By not raising up a son for his brother. Right? He's erasing Er from Israel. And he is taking his place, right? Trying to take a bigger share of Judah's inheritance. That's what you're doing whenever you move the landmark. You are taking someone else's place in Israel. And this is why it's so bad. This is why the law leaves the punishment basically up to God himself. This is what we read elsewhere in Deuteronomy. Chapter 27, verse 17. Cursed be anyone who moves his neighbor's landmark. And all the people shall say, Amen. This takes place as part of a series of curses that the whole nation of Israel has to verbalize. And one of those curses is, cursed be anyone who moves his neighbor's landmark. Right? So all of the people of Israel have to confess that yes, that is the case. Anyone who moves his neighbor's landmark shall be cursed. Now, by saying that such a person is cursed, the law says that God himself will punish the wrongdoer. That is the meaning of a curse. You are invoking divine wrath. That's why you're not supposed to curse anybody. Right? But the law says that the one who moves the landmark shall be cursed. God himself will punish such a person. Again, just as God struck down Onan. Now, there's some applications that we can take from this. First off, in part, I think this possibly explains some of the difficulty that the early church had in accepting Gentiles into the church. Because I imagine that allowing the Gentiles in probably struck some of the early Jewish converts as moving the landmarks. Right? Because again, they see the promises of Christ as, in this language of the eternal inheritance. Again, just as we saw in Hebrews. This is God fulfilling his promises to Israel. Remember, God has done that through Jesus Christ. And so if you're an early Jewish convert in the first century, if you're part of the Jerusalem church, again, you're interpreting all of this in terms of what you know from the law of Moses, how the promises of God function. And then you see Gentiles claiming to be followers of Jesus Christ and claiming to have received the Holy Spirit. And that's, again, I have a hard time imagining that it wouldn't cause problems for Jewish converts, Jewish Christians, who are raised in that, no, you don't take someone else's place in the promised land. Right? And certainly, God is bringing more people into his eternal inheritance in the book of Acts. Now, from our reading in the New Testament, it turns out that those who opposed the inclusion of the Gentiles, they were the ones moving the landmarks. Right? Because God chose to give the Gentiles a place in his inheritance. And some in the early church couldn't accept it, so they attempted to preclude the Gentiles, either entirely or on the basis of their lack of circumcision. Right? But they're moving the landmarks. Right? They're saying, here's how much of the promised land you get to live in, if you get to live in it at all. Again, we're talking the We're speaking spiritually, allegorically here, not the physical promised land. Some in the early church, what Paul calls the circumcision party, they're trying to set the boundary markers. And here's where we need to draw our spiritual lesson from the landmark laws. Right? It's not just theft. Remember how the promised land is divvied up. It's not divvied up by choice, it's divvied up by lot. And remember how landmark moving is punished. It is done by curse. In other words, it is God who acts in both cases. God is the one who set the original boundary lines in Israel. God is the one who chose where each tribe is going to be in the promised land, where each clan is going to be within each tribe, how much land each clan gets, exactly what their boundary lines are. Right? What the landmarks show is God's sovereign choice. It's not that, hey, this guy from this clan and this other guy from this other clan who happen to be, they have adjoining properties. They just hashed it out one day and this is where they divided the line. No, that's where God set the line. And it's just man's way of showing where God set the line. God defines his eternal inheritance, not me, not man, not anybody. It's not my right to move the landmarks and to say, this thing that God says is necessary actually isn't necessary. Right? And it's, in other words, it's not my place to switch metaphors here, to move the goalposts. Right? Because that's essentially what's going on when we look at the landmarks allegorically. We're looking at the boundary markers. Who's in the faith? What place do we have in the faith? Right? Who has salvation? Who receives the promises of God? It's not my place to move the landmarks in either direction. It's not my place to say, well, this thing that God says is necessary actually is not necessary. Right? We have to take care how we enforce that, because it is in a congregation's purview, as we read in the New Testament, to enforce orthodoxy within the congregation. So, for us to accept someone as a brother and sister in Christ, we require that they confess Christ. We require that they are baptized, that they repent of their sins. Right? There are places that we read in the New Testament of unacceptable behavior that, if it's not cleared up, the congregation disfellowships or excommunicates that person. Right? It's within the congregation's purview to enforce that. But it's not my place to play salvation police for humanity at large, or for Christendom at large. For the universal church, as it were. All right? It's not my place to act like the circumcision party and say, here are my other standards that we're going to set up. Right? It's not even, ultimately, it's not my place to go around to every congregation on earth and enforce orthodoxy myself. Again, remember, the one who moves the landmark, cursed be he. That means it's not up to me. It is ultimately up to God. And that can be a hard line to walk, right? Being able to enforce orthodoxy at a local, at a congregational level, but not to play salvation police for humanity at large. But that's the line that we're called to walk. And that call is rooted here in the law, right? We don't try to cut others out of the eternal inheritance. Rather, we accept with joy the inheritance that we have been given by God. And we do what we can to maintain our inheritance and to use it in the way that God has appointed for us. Now let's return to the Old Testament. We're going to look at a case study for how this works. We're going to turn our attention to the story of Naboth's vineyard in 1 Kings chapter 21. We'll read the first 16 verses. Now Naboth the Jezreelite had a vineyard in Jezreel, beside the palace of Ahab king of Samaria. And after this Ahab said to Naboth, "Give me your vineyard, that I may have it for a vegetable garden, because it is near my house, and I will give you a better vineyard for it. Or if it seems good to you, I will give you its value in money." But Naboth said to Ahab, "The Lord forbid that I should give you the inheritance of my fathers." And Ahab went into his house vexed and sullen because of what Naboth the Jezreelite had said to him. For he had said, "I will not give you the inheritance of my fathers." And he lay down on his bed and turned away his face and would eat no food. But Jezebel his wife came to him and said, "Why is your spirit so vexed that you eat no food?" And he said to her, "Because I spoke to Naboth the Jezreelite, and said to him, 'Give me your vineyard for money, or else if it please you, I'll give you another vineyard for it.' And he answered, 'I'll not give you my vineyard.' And Jezebel his wife said to him, 'Do you now govern Israel? Arise, eat bread, and let your heart be cheerful. I will give you the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite.' So she wrote letters in Ahab's name, and sealed them with his seal, and she sent the letters to the elders and the leaders who lived with Naboth in his city. And she wrote in the letters, 'Proclaim a fast, and set Naboth at the head of the people, and set 2 worthless men opposite him, and let them bring a charge against him, saying, You have cursed God and the king. Then take him out and stone him to death.' And the men of his city, the elders and the leaders who lived in his city, did as Jezebel had sent word to them. As it was written in the letters that she had sent to them, they proclaimed a fast, and set Naboth at the head of the people, and the 2 worthless men came in and sat opposite him, and the worthless men brought a charge against Naboth in the presence of the people, saying, Naboth cursed God and the king. So they took him outside the city and stoned him to death with stones. Then they sent to Jezebel, saying, Naboth has been stoned, he is dead. As soon as Jezebel heard that Naboth had been stoned and was dead, Jezebel said to Ahab, Arise, take possession of the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite, which he refused to give you for money, for Naboth is not alive, but dead. And as soon as Ahab heard that Naboth was dead, Ahab arose to go down to the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite to take possession of it. You might remember last week that I characterized the 9th commandment, you shall not bear false witness, as a law concerning property. This is why. This is the sense in which it is a property law. We know that blasphemy is almost always a capital offense. It was not uncommon in antiquity for the person who exposed blasphemy to receive the blasphemer's property as compensation. And that seems to be what has happened in Naboth's case. Without that understanding, the story doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Right? Ahab would have no claim on the land, even if Naboth had been put to death. It would pass to, we've seen the law. It would pass to his sons first. If he has no sons, it would pass to daughters. Then it would pass to his, to his father's household. Either his father's brother's sons or his father's brothers, or the nearest of kin. In other words, basically anybody but Ahab. And so, how does Ahab end up taking possession of this vineyard? Well, it's because Jezebel sets up this conspiracy in Jezreel for the elders to falsely accuse Naboth of blasphemy and stone him to death for it. There's a lot of rotten stuff happening in this text. We could spend a lot of time talking about the conspiracy and just the complete breakdown, the complete failure of justice in this story. At any number of points, this plot should not have worked. The law has all kinds of things set up that should have prevented Ahab from taking Naboth's vineyard as his possession. And Israel blows all of it. It's not just Ahab and Jezebel, it's also the very elders of Jezreel who are supposed to uphold justice in the city of Jezreel. The whole thing is crooked. The whole thing is, it's all corrupt from top to bottom. And the result is that Naboth ends up dead on this trumped-up charge, and Ahab gains possession of part of his inheritance. And again, look at Naboth's objection. The reason he will not sell the land or barter it away is because it is his father's inheritance, right? He says, the Lord forbid that I should give you the inheritance of my fathers. Naboth's got the right attitude about his land. It doesn't belong to him. It's not his to dispose of as he pleases. But Ahab strips him of his place in Israel by making him a blasphemer, just so that he can take his land. Again, it's every bit as bad as what Onan does with Tamar in Genesis 38. Every bit as rotten, and then some. But that's what's going on here, is that he has falsely accused Naboth so that he can take his land. It's, again, this is like moving the boundary markers on steroids. This is why the law forbids moving the boundary markers, coveting your neighbor's land, all of these sorts of things. In fact, I might do this in the future. You could probably go through this one story and find all 10 of the commandments being violated in this one story. I haven't sat down and thought about it yet, but that just now struck me. It's probably true, too. I'll have to see about that later. But I think that's what's going on. The question, again, as far as the 9th commandment goes, is, well, why would someone bear false witness? What's the motive for that? Right, we could imagine several motives, but acquiring your neighbor's property for it is a really strong motive for bearing false witness. So, that's it for our study this week. We've seen how the law restricts one's use of the land, how the law puts you under obligation concerning your own property. We will see those themes continue into next week's study when we look at movable property, such as livestock and slaves. And that will take us into looking at what the law of Moses has to say about slaves, which I know is an extremely sensitive and uncomfortable topic, because we have our own legacy of race-based slavery that we have to contend with. And for that very reason, the law of Moses has been a huge target for atheists and for others who are antithetical to Judaism and Christianity both, to say, well, look, how can the good and perfect God permit Israel to keep slaves? So we'll be talking about those things next week. And Lord willing, dealing with them in a sensitive and biblical manner. I just want us to finish out this week with just remembering what all of this is pointing forward to. We have an eternal inheritance in Christ Jesus, something that cannot be taken from us by any man, something that cannot be acquired with money, something that is the gift of God. And woe be to us if we try to gain this inheritance illegitimately, if we try to edge anyone else out of the inheritance, if we engage in any of these kinds of behaviors that we have seen the law prohibiting in an allegorical and spiritual sense. We are to accept with joy what we have received from God, and to not covet after what someone else has received, and try to edge them out. Let us never be like Onan. Let us never be like Naboth. Let us never be the sorts of people who engage in these sorts of activities. So, we look forward to seeing you again next week. And actually, speaking of which, if you're just watching us on YouTube, you will probably notice that this week there is not a Philippians sermon up on the channel. And you will probably, Lord willing, you will see a brief recording of our sermon in the auditorium. At 14th, we are on I'm going to say a limited basis, returning to the regular worship assembly. And I mean limited in the sense that we're not going straight back to our old schedule of morning Bible class followed by an hour of worship, followed by an hour of worship in the evening, and midweek Bible class. We're meeting together for an abbreviated service. A couple of songs, a couple of prayers, the Lord's Supper, and a brief message. And Lord willing, we'll have that message recorded tomorrow. My aim is to, while we're in this kind of transition from being completely locked down to opening up, to continue developing, writing and recording and posting sermons on Philippians and on whatever text we want to move to after Philippians. Keep doing some full-length sermons that I'll post up on the channel. For this week, with trying to get everything open at the church building, I just simply did not have enough time to do all of those things and get an extra sermon together. So that's my aim for the future. We'll be doing a Bible class that I post here on YouTube, a sermon that I post here on YouTube, and then a very brief, you can barely even call it a sermon, I suppose, a brief message, a homily, maybe you can call it, for our worship assembly on Sunday mornings. So those are the things that, Lord willing, you can expect to see on the channel. So until next time, take care. Bye-bye.